The Galactic Council chamber fell silent as the holographic display flickered to life, showing the grim statistics that everyone had come to dread. Ambassador Threll of the Xandari Empire stood before the assembled representatives, his four eyes dimming with exhaustion. The numbers told a story no one wanted to hear. 15 star systems had gone dark in the past cycle alone. The consuming swarm, as it had come to be known, showed no signs of slowing its inexorable march across the galaxy. "We have lost contact with the Meridian colonies," Threll announced, his voice carrying the weight of billions of lives. That brings the total to 43 systems in 6 standard months. The council members shifted in their seats, their various forms of distress evident across a dozen different species. The Valix delegation, their crystalline bodies refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns, dimmed noticeably. The towering Chromath representatives clicked their mandibles in agitation. Even the serene Luminae, beings of pure energy contained in environmental suits, flickered with uncertainty. Commander Zyphex of the combined fleet stood next, her scaled hands clasped behind her back in military precision. "We have deployed our finest battle groups," she reported. "The swarm adapts to every weapon we use. Plasma cannons, antimatter missiles, quantum disruptors. Nothing stops them for long. They consume the technology, learn from it, and evolve countermeasures within hours." The swarm had appeared 6 months ago at the edge of the galaxy, a mass of biomechanical entities that defied conventional understanding. They were neither fully organic nor fully machine, but something far more terrifying. They consumed everything in their path: planets, ships, stations, breaking matter down to its base components and incorporating it into their ever-growing mass. Worse, they learned. Every engagement with the combined fleet made them stronger, smarter, more efficient. "What about the Centauri battle meditation?" asked Representative Krell, his tentacles writhing with anxiety. "Their mental powers have ended conflicts for millennia." "The swarm has no unified consciousness to target," Zyphex replied grimly. "The Centauri masters attempted to reach them. 3 of their most powerful adepts died screaming, their minds shattered by what they touched. They described it as trying to reason with a hurricane made of hunger." A heavy silence descended upon the chamber. The greatest military minds in the galaxy had thrown everything at the swarm. The Chromath had deployed their legendary siege engines, weapons capable of cracking planets. The Valix had unleashed their molecular disassemblers. The Luminae had even attempted to go nova near a swarm concentration, sacrificing an entire star system in a desperate gambit. Nothing worked. The swarm had simply absorbed it all, growing larger and more sophisticated with each failed attempt. "There must be something," Threll said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Some weapon we have not tried, some strategy we have overlooked." The chamber's main door suddenly chimed, indicating an unscheduled arrival. Security protocols should have prevented any interruption, but the door slid open anyway. A figure strode in, humanoid in appearance, but distinctly different from any council species. It wore a simple gray uniform with no visible weapons or technology beyond a basic communication device. "Forgive the intrusion," the newcomer said in heavily accented Galactic Standard. "My name is Sarah Chen. I represent the Terran Federation. We have been monitoring your situation, and we believe we can help." The council members exchanged glances. Humanity was known to them, but only barely. The humans had achieved faster-than-light travel just 20 years ago and had been quarantined to their home system by mutual agreement of the Council. They were classified as a Level 2 civilization, too primitive to fully participate in galactic affairs, too dangerous to completely ignore. Reports from the monitoring stations described them as violent, unpredictable, and suffering from over 300 distinct forms of mental illness that seemed to be considered normal in their culture. "This is a closed session," Threll said, though curiosity colored his tone. "How did you bypass our security?" Sarah smiled, and something about that expression made several council members uncomfortable. We asked nicely, "Your security artificial intelligence appreciated the change of pace, but that is not important. What matters is that we have studied the swarm for the past 3 months. We have a solution." Commander Zyfex's scales rippled with barely concealed irritation. The combined might of 16 advanced civilizations has failed to stop the swarm. What could a species that only recently discovered jump drive technology possibly offer? "Perspective," Sarah replied simply. She walked to the holographic display and manipulated it with surprising ease, calling up data that should not have been accessible to her. "You have all approached this as a military problem. You see the swarm as an enemy to be defeated with superior technology and firepower. But the swarm is not an enemy. It is a force of nature, like a fire or a flood." "Semantics," Krell muttered. "Call it what you will, the result is the same. Entire worlds consumed." "Not semantics," Sarah countered. "Understanding. You cannot reason with a hurricane, but you can redirect it. You cannot negotiate with a wildfire, but you can create a firebreak. The swarm operates on simple principles: consume, grow, adapt. You have been feeding it the very thing it craves most." She expanded the holographic display, showing patterns in the swarm's movement that the council analysts had missed. "Look at the progression. It does not move randomly. It seeks out dense concentrations of advanced technology and complex matter. Your attempts to fight it have created a trail of irresistible targets. Every destroyed warship, every sacrificed station, every evacuated colony leaves behind exactly what the swarm wants." The council chamber erupted in protest, but Threll raised a hand for silence. His tactical mind was already racing ahead, seeing the terrible logic in her words. "You are suggesting we have been making the situation worse." "Unintentionally, yes," Sarah confirmed. "The swarm is attracted to complexity. Your civilizations have spent millennia refining your technology, creating increasingly sophisticated tools and weapons. To the swarm, you are the most appetizing meal in the galaxy." Zyfex stepped forward, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Then what do you propose? That we simply allow it to consume us?" "No," Sarah said. "We propose that we do what we do best. We be human." She pressed a button on her communicator, and the holographic display changed again. This time it showed Earth, humanity's homeworld. The planet was a mess by galactic standards, polluted, overpopulated, scarred by countless wars and environmental disasters. Yet it teemed with life, chaotic and resilient. "Humanity has never had the luxury of elegance," Sarah explained. "We have spent our entire history making do with whatever we could scrape together. We are not sophisticated. We do not have your advanced technology or your refined cultures. What we have is adaptability born from desperation and creativity born from limitation." She pulled up another display showing human military equipment. It looked primitive compared to council technology: kinetic weapons, chemical explosives, rudimentary armor. "For every problem, we have developed 100 crude solutions. We do not optimize, we improvise. We do not perfect, we iterate. And most importantly, we do not give up." Threll studied the data, his analytical mind processing the implications. "You want to fight the swarm with inferior technology." "Not inferior," Sarah corrected. "Simple, predictable, boring. The swarm adapts to complexity because complexity offers more to learn, more to incorporate. But there is nothing to learn from a rock thrown hard enough. There is no evolutionary advantage to gain from a pointy stick. The universe is built on simple principles, and we have never forgotten that." The other council members were now paying attention despite themselves. The idea was insane, yet it held a certain logic that their sophisticated minds had overlooked in their search for complex solutions. "You are proposing a fighting retreat," Zyfex said slowly. using primitive methods to avoid feeding the swarm's growth. More than that, Sarah replied, we are proposing a trap. The swarm seeks complexity. We give it simplicity. It expects resistance. We give it compliance. It has learned to adapt to everything you have thrown at it, but it has never encountered something that refuses to play by the rules it has come to expect. She outlined the human plan. It was audacious to the point of madness. Evacuate the threatened sectors using basic, low-tech transport. Strip the colonies bare of advanced technology. Leave behind nothing but simple structures and basic materials. Create a path of least resistance that would guide the swarm toward a prepared killing ground. And what waits at this killing ground? Threll asked. Sarah's smile turned cold. Us. 3 billion humans with nothing but spite, stubbornness, and an extensive history of killing things that threaten us. We have studied the swarm. It has weaknesses you have not exploited because they seem too crude for civilized beings to consider. She pulled up final schematics. The swarm's biomechanical nature means it is vulnerable to biological agents it cannot quickly adapt to because they are not deployed technologically. It is vulnerable to simple physics it cannot learn from because there is nothing to learn. It is vulnerable to tactics that make no logical sense because humanity gave up on pure logic approximately 10,000 years ago. The council members looked at each other. The proposal went against everything they had built their civilizations upon. It was primitive, inelegant, and deeply uncomfortable. It also might be their only chance. Commander Zyfek spoke first. If we agree to this insanity, what do you need from us? Transportation, communication, and the wisdom to stay out of our way, Sarah replied. We will need your ships to evacuate civilians and move our forces into position. We will need your communication networks to coordinate, but when the fighting starts, you must trust us to do what we do best. And what is that? Asked Krell. Sarah's expression was grim. Survive. No matter what it takes, no matter how ugly it gets, humanity survives. We have been doing it on a hostile world for hundreds of thousands of years. The swarm is just another predator, and humanity has a perfect record against predators. Ambassador Threll made the decision that would change galactic history. Very well, the Council authorizes the Terran Federation to implement its plan. May the ancient stars have mercy on us all. They will not, Sarah said, but we will not need them. We have something better. What? Threll asked. Each other, she replied, and an unreasonable refusal to accept the inevitable. The evacuation began within hours. Human ships, crude and inelegant by galactic standards, arrived in the threatened sectors. They were not beautiful vessels like the Valix light sails, or efficient like the Chromath dreadnoughts. They were functional, built from whatever materials were available, and they flew with a determination that bordered on recklessness. The human crews worked alongside Council personnel, stripping stations and colonies of advanced technology with ruthless efficiency. Dr. James Park oversaw the Biological Warfare Division of the Human Response. He stood in a laboratory aboard the flagship, surrounded by equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a cutting-edge research facility. But appearances were deceiving. The humans had spent 3 months studying swarm samples captured from the battlefield, and they had found something interesting. The swarm is incredibly adaptable, James explained to a group of skeptical Valix scientists, but adaptation takes time and energy. If we hit it with enough different threats simultaneously, we can overwhelm its capacity to respond. He gestured to rows of sealed containers. These are engineered viruses, bacteria, fungi, and prions. Each one targets a different aspect of the swarm's biomechanical structure. Separately, they would be defeated within hours. Together, released in a coordinated assault, they will force the swarm to divert massive resources to survival rather than growth. One of the Valix scientists, its crystalline form flickering with confusion, asked, "But biological weapons are forbidden by 17 different galactic treaties. They are considered too barbaric for civilized warfare. James looked at the alien with tired eyes. We are not civilized. We are human. And when something threatens to eat our species, we do not consult treaties. We consult our history, and our history is written in blood, fire, and the bones of everything that ever tried to make us extinct. The Valak scientist recoiled slightly at the vehemence in his voice, but James was not finished. You want to know what makes humanity dangerous? It is not our weapons or our technology. It is that we remember. We remember the ice ages that nearly killed us. We remember the plagues that devastated our populations. We remember the wars that burned our cities. And we remember how we survived every single time, not by being stronger or smarter, but by being too stubborn to die. Meanwhile, on the fortress world designated as the Killing Ground, General Amara Washington supervised the preparation of defenses. The planet had been stripped of all advanced technology. What remained was something that would have been familiar to a human from 10,000 years ago. Trenches, bunkers, simple fortifications made from local materials. But these primitive defenses were built with modern understanding of physics and biology. The trenches were not just holes in the ground. They were carefully calculated channels designed to funnel the swarm into predetermined kill zones. The bunkers were not just shelters. They were distribution points for weapons that would have made council species shudder with their crudeness. Chemical accelerators that launched metal projectiles, combustion-based explosives, even more primitive tools, sharp objects attached to long handles, heavy rocks positioned to create avalanches, fire in its most basic and terrifying form. Amara stood on a hill overlooking the primary defense line, watching as 3 billion humans prepared for the battle of their species' existence. They were volunteers all, knowing that casualties would be catastrophic. But they had come anyway, because that was what humans did. When the universe threatened them, they did not calculate odds or surrender to logic. They picked up whatever was at hand and fought. A young soldier approached her, barely 20 years old by Earth reckoning. His name was David, and he carried a weapon that was essentially a chemical-powered metal thrower, a gun in human terminology. It was laughably primitive compared to the plasma rifles carried by council troops. "General," David said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes, "do you really think this will work?" Amara considered lying, considered offering false comfort. But humans deserve the truth. "I do not know," she admitted. "The swarm has defeated every sophisticated defense the galaxy could muster. Our plan is to be so unsophisticated that it cannot adapt. It is the stupidest military strategy ever conceived, which means it might be brilliant." David managed a weak smile. "That sounds about right for humanity. Get some rest," Amara ordered. "The swarm will be here in 36 hours. After that, we will either be heroes or extinct. Either way, we will give them a fight worth remembering." As David walked away, Amara pulled out a small photograph she kept in her uniform pocket. It showed Earth from orbit, that beautiful blue marble that had birthed humanity and kicked them out of the nest into a hostile galaxy. Whatever happened in the coming battle, she would make sure the swarm learned one fundamental truth: humans did not go quietly into extinction. The swarm advanced across the evacuated sectors, following the trail of abandoned technology and simple materials that humanity had laid out like breadcrumbs. It grew larger with each consumed station, but its growth was slower than before. The simple materials offered less complexity to incorporate, less sophistication to learn from. This frustrated the swarm's evolved instincts, driving it forward with increasing aggression toward what it sensed ahead: a concentration of life and matter on the fortress world. In the council chamber, Ambassador Threll watched the tactical displays with mounting anxiety. The human plan was proceeding exactly as Sarah had described, which somehow made it more terrifying rather than less. The council species understood elegant solutions, optimized strategies, and calculated risks. What the humans were proposing was none of those things. It was desperation weaponized, chaos organized, madness given purpose. "They are insane," Zyphex muttered beside him, watching as human forces staged mock retreats and apparent panics to draw the swarm forward. "This entire species is clinically insane." "Perhaps," Threll replied, "or perhaps we have been too sane for too long. Sometimes the universe requires a bit of controlled insanity to maintain balance." Sarah Chen stood nearby, monitoring communications from the fortress world. Her expression was calm, but Threll had learned to read human body language over the past weeks. The tension in her shoulders, the way her hands occasionally clenched into fists, she was as terrified as anyone. But she hid it behind determination and faith in her species. "Your people are brave," Threll said quietly. Sarah shook her head. "No, we are scared out of our minds. But being brave was never about not being afraid. It was about being afraid and doing what needed to be done anyway. Every human on that planet knows they might die. They went anyway because that is what we do. We show up. We fight. We do not surrender to the inevitable." The swarm reached the outer defenses of the fortress world exactly on schedule. The first wave crashed against the primitive fortifications like a tide of hungry metal and twisted flesh. Human defenders opened fire with weapons that had not changed fundamentally in centuries. Projectiles accelerated by chemical reactions, explosives that relied on rapid combustion, even blades for close combat. It looked like a joke, primitives fighting the apocalypse with tools from their violent past. But something unexpected happened. The swarm, accustomed to adapting to sophisticated weapons, found nothing to adapt to. A metal projectile moving at high velocity was just physics. There was no technology to learn, no complexity to incorporate. The swarm took casualties, real casualties, for the first time in months. Dr. James Park watched from an orbiting ship as the biological weapons were deployed. Missiles, crude and simple, rained down on the swarm concentrations. They carried no antimatter warheads or quantum disruptors. Instead, they burst open to release clouds of engineered pathogens, each one targeting different aspects of the swarm's hybrid biology. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The swarm tried to adapt, tried to evolve resistances, but the sheer variety of threats overwhelmed its capacity. While it fought off bacterial infections, fungal growths took hold. While it adapted to viruses, prions corrupted its information systems. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each cut too simple and too different to effectively counter. "It is working," James whispered, watching the swarms advance slow and then stop as it diverted resources to survival. "It is actually working." On the ground, General Amara Washington led her troops in a counterattack that would have been considered suicide by any rational military doctrine. Human soldiers charged into close combat with the swarm, using tactics that were primitive beyond belief. They stabbed, they burned, they bludgeoned. They used gravity against the enemy, triggering landslides and cave-ins. They contaminated water supplies. They even spread false information through captured swarm nodes, confusing its distributed intelligence with contradictory data. It was brutal, ugly, and terrifyingly effective. The swarm, evolved to counter technological threats, found itself vulnerable to the oldest form of warfare in the universe: direct, simple, overwhelming violence applied with creativity born from desperation. David fired his primitive weapon until it overheated, then grabbed a metal pole with a sharpened end and kept fighting. Around him, other humans did the same. They were bleeding, exhausted, terrified, but they did not stop, could not stop, because stopping meant extinction, and humanity had looked extinction in the eye too many times to flinch now. "Forward!" Amara's voice rang out across the battlefield. "Push them back! Show these things what happens when they threaten humanity." The battle raged for 72 hours without pause. Human casualties were devastating. nearly 40% of the defending force. But the swarm's losses were worse. For every human that fell, 100 swarm entities were destroyed by weapons so simple that they could have been built by humanity's ancestors thousands of years ago. And slowly, impossibly, the tide turned. The swarm began to retreat, its collective intelligence recognizing that this battlefield offered only death without the payoff of technological advancement. It tried to withdraw to find easier targets, but humanity had anticipated this. Sarah Chen gave the order that ended the threat. Spring the trap. All around the fortress world, hidden in the asteroid belt and waiting in cold orbits, human ships activated. They were not warships. They were transports, cargo haulers, even civilian vessels pressed into military service. And they were all filled with the same cargo, simple materials. Rock, iron, carbon, basic elements in their most unrefined forms. Tons upon tons of it, launched in a coordinated bombardment that surrounded the swarm completely. The aliens had expected sophisticated weapons. They got avalanche of stupid matter moving at relativistic speeds. The kinetic impacts were devastating. The swarm tried to absorb the incoming matter, but there was too much of it, coming too fast, from too many directions. It was overwhelmed not by complexity, but by sheer, brutal simplicity. Mass times velocity equals destructive force, one of the oldest equations in physics, applied with human ruthlessness. When the bombardment ended, the swarm had been reduced to scattered remnants, its central intelligence shattered, its capacity to threaten the galaxy broken. Human forces moved in to finish the job, methodically destroying every last fragment with fire, chemical weapons, and occasionally just hitting things with rocks until they stopped moving. The council watched in stunned silence as the fortress world fell quiet. Against all logic, against all probability, the primitive species from the quarantine system had defeated a threat that had brought the galaxy to its knees. Ambassador Threll was the first to speak. They did it. The humans actually did it. Commander Zyfex's scales had lost all color. I have witnessed something I cannot explain to my superiors. How do I write a report stating that crude projectile weapons and biological warfare defeated an enemy that shrugged off our most advanced technology? You tell them the truth, Sarah Chen said, her voice tired but satisfied. You tell them that sometimes the best solution is not the most sophisticated one. Sometimes you need to stop thinking like civilized beings and start thinking like survivors. And nobody survives like humans. The aftermath of the battle brought changes that rippled through the entire galaxy. The Council, forced to confront the reality that their technological superiority had made them vulnerable rather than strong, began to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about warfare, technology, and progress itself. Humanity, previously dismissed as primitive and quarantined to their home system, found themselves elevated to a position of respect and fear. The Council offered them full membership, access to galactic trade networks, and most importantly, recognition as a species that had saved civilization itself. But the humans were not what the Council expected. They accepted membership, but refused to give up their simple weapons. They adopted galactic technology, but kept their primitive backup systems. They learned sophisticated tactics, but never forgot the value of a sharp stick applied with sufficient force. Sarah Chen found herself appointed as humanity's permanent ambassador to the Council, a position she accepted with reluctance. She stood before the assembled representatives 1 month after the battle, preparing to give her first official speech. The Council has asked me to explain what made humanity's defense successful, she began. The answer is both simple and complex. We succeeded because we never forgot where we came from. We are not an ancient species with millennia of refinement. We are barely out of our caves, barely off our homeworld, barely past killing each other over resources and territory. She paused, letting her words sink in. But that is our strength. We remember hunger, so we fight harder when threatened. We remember cold, so we adapt to hostile environments. We remember pain, so we endure what others cannot. Every human carries in their genetic memory the accumulated experience of survival against impossible odds. Threll listened intently, finally beginning to understand the strange species that had saved his civilization. They were not sophisticated, but they were survivors in the purest sense of the word. They had evolved not to perfect their society, but to outlast anything the universe threw at them. The swarm nearly destroyed us because we sought to fight it with our greatest achievements, Sarah continued. Our most advanced weapons, our most sophisticated strategies, our most refined tactics. But the swarm fed on sophistication. It grew stronger from our complexity. Humanity won because we were willing to abandon sophistication and embrace simplicity. We fought the swarm the same way our ancestors fought ice ages and predators, with determination, creativity, and whatever tools were at hand. She looked around the chamber at the diverse species gathered there. You need to understand something about humans. We are not special. We are not chosen. We are not destined for greatness. We are a species that has survived by being too stubborn to die. When the universe says something cannot be done, humanity hears a challenge. When physics dictates certain outcomes, we look for loopholes. When logic demands surrender, we check our ammunition count and keep fighting. General Amara Washington stood at attention during the ceremony honoring the fallen. 3 billion humans had volunteered for the defense. 1.2 billion had died. It was a casualty rate that would have broken any other species' morale. But humanity had seen worse. They had survived plagues that killed half their population. They had endured wars that devastated continents. They had looked at extinction more times than anyone cared to count and always found a way forward. She read names of the dead, knowing that every name represented a life, a story, a person who had chosen to stand against the darkness. David, the young soldier she had spoken to before the battle. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, who had volunteered to test biological weapons on herself to verify their safety for human deployment. Captain Thompson, who had piloted a damaged ship on a suicide run to draw swarm forces away from civilian evacuees. The list went on for hours, and Amara read every name because they deserved to be remembered. When she finished, she spoke the words that had become humanity's unofficial motto during the crisis. We are human. We showed up. We fought. We did what needed to be done. And we are still here. Dr. James Park transitioned from weapons designer to something unexpected, a teacher. Species from across the galaxy wanted to understand how humanity had defeated the swarm. They expected complex theories and sophisticated analysis. What they got was lessons in basics. You forgot that complexity is a liability as often as it is an asset, James told a classroom of alien scientists. You built weapons that could crack planets, but you never considered that sometimes all you need is a rock moving fast enough. You developed diseases that could target specific genetic markers, but you forgot that simple poison works just as well and adapts less easily. He held up a basic chemical projectile weapon, the kind humanity had used for centuries. This is not elegant. It is not efficient by your standards, but it works. It worked on Earth against every predator and enemy we ever faced. It worked against the swarm. Sometimes the oldest solutions are the best because they are proven. They have survived the test of time, not because they are perfect, but because they are good enough. The council species struggled with this concept. They had spent so long pursuing perfection that they had forgotten the value of good enough. But they were learning, slowly, that humanity's willingness to accept imperfect solutions and adapt on the fly offered advantages that perfect planning never could. Sarah met with council leadership 6 months after the battle. The galaxy was recovering, rebuilding the systems that had been damaged or destroyed. The swarm's remnants had been hunted down and eliminated, but everyone knew more threats would come eventually. The universe was not a safe place, and it never had been. "We have a proposal," Ambassador Threll said. "The Council wishes to establish a joint defensive force, a combination of Council technology and human tactical flexibility. Together, we believe we can defend against any future threats." Sarah considered this carefully. Under certain conditions, the Council must accept that humanity's methods, while crude, are sometimes necessary. "You must trust us to do what needs to be done without micromanaging based on cultural squeamishness. And most importantly, you must understand that if another crisis arises, we will not ask permission to use whatever tools are necessary for survival." "Those are significant concessions," Zyfex noted. "They are necessary concessions," Sarah countered. "You brought us into this because your sophisticated approaches failed. Do not waste the lesson by trying to civilize us into ineffectiveness. Humanity's strength comes from being uncivilized enough to survive. Take that away, and you lose what makes us valuable." Threll exchanged glances with the other council members. Finally, he nodded. "Agreed. The Joint Defensive Force will operate under protocols that respect both council sophistication and human pragmatism. We will learn from each other." Back on Earth, humanity grappled with its new place in the galaxy. Some feared that exposure to advanced alien cultures would change them, soften them, make them less capable of the brutal practicality that had saved civilization. Others argued that learning from the Council species would only make humanity stronger. David, recovered from his injuries sustained in the battle, stood at a memorial overlooking the fortress world's primary battlefield. The scars were still visible, trenches carved into the landscape, impact craters from kinetic bombardments, burn marks from fire weapons that would have been familiar to ancient humans. It looked barbaric compared to the elegant battlefields of Council wars. But it had worked. A young child approached him, barely 10 years old. She looked up at the memorial, at the names carved into simple stone, another primitive human tradition that had survived into the space age. "Why does it say, 'We showed up'?" she asked, pointing to the inscription at the memorial's base. David smiled, remembering General Washington's words before the battle. "Because sometimes that is all it takes. Sometimes the difference between extinction and survival is just being there, being willing to fight even when victory seems impossible. Humanity has always shown up. We showed up when ice ages threatened to freeze us to death. We showed up when plagues tried to wipe us out. We showed up when wars nearly destroyed our civilization. And we showed up when the swarm threatened the entire galaxy." "But we are not special," the child said, repeating what she had been taught in school. "We are not chosen or destined." "Exactly," David replied. "We are not special. We are just too stubborn to quit. And sometimes that is the only special quality you need." The galaxy moved forward, forever changed by the crisis and its resolution. The Council species had learned humility and the value of simplicity. Humanity had learned that their primitive origins were not a source of shame, but a source of strength. New protocols were established for the Joint Defensive Force. Council ships were retrofitted with backup systems that relied on simple mechanical principles rather than sophisticated technology. Council soldiers trained in primitive warfare techniques alongside human instructors. The most advanced civilizations in the galaxy found themselves learning lessons from one of the youngest species: how to fight dirty, how to adapt quickly, how to make do with whatever was available. But perhaps the most important change was philosophical. The Council had always believed that progress meant moving away from primitive origins, that sophistication was the ultimate goal. Humanity had proven that sometimes progress meant remembering where you came from and keeping the simple tools sharp. Ambassador Sarah Chen walked through the Council headquarters 1 year after the battle. She passed representatives from dozens of species, all of them nodding respectfully to the human who had helped save their civilizations. It was a far cry from the quarantine species status humanity had held just months before. She found Ambassador Threll in his office, studying reports on the Joint Defensive Forces' progress. He looked up as she entered, his four eyes reflecting something that might have been amusement. "I have been reading historical records of humanity," Threll said. "Your species has faced extinction at least 17 times in your documented history. Asteroid impacts, supervolcano eruptions, ice ages, plagues, nuclear wars nearly fought but narrowly avoided. Yet you are still here." 18 times, Sarah corrected. "You forgot the Toba supervolcano eruption that reduced our population to less than 10,000 individuals. We almost did not make it through that one." "How?" Threll asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "How does a species come that close to extinction and not only survive, but thrive?" Sarah considered the question. "I think it is because we never accept that the end is inevitable. Other species calculate odds and surrender when the numbers say all is lost. Humans look at those same odds and figure out how to cheat. We are optimists by necessity. If we accepted reality, we would have gone extinct millennia ago. So we live in a state of determined delusion, convinced that we can survive anything if we are stubborn enough." "Determined delusion," Threll repeated. "That may be the most accurate description of humanity I have heard." Sarah laughed. "We prefer to call it hope, but yes, determined delusion works too. And it has served us well enough. We are still here. The swarm is not. I would call that a victory for delusion over logic." General Washington retired from active military service after the battle. She had given enough years to war, lost enough people she cared about. But retirement for her did not mean rest. She became an instructor, teaching the next generation of human soldiers and their council counterparts the lessons learned from the swarm war. Her classes were brutal, demanding, and completely different from traditional council military training. She taught her students to fight when their technology failed. She taught them to improvise weapons from their environment. She taught them that elegant defeat was still defeat, while ugly victory was still victory. "The council species fight like they have something to lose," she told her students. "They calculate acceptable casualties, strategic withdrawals, and preservation of forces. Those are all valid tactics. But sometimes you need soldiers who fight like they have already lost everything and have nothing left but spite. That is where humanity excels." She demonstrated by having her students fight training exercises with progressively fewer resources. Start with full equipment, then lose the advanced weapons, then lose the basic weapons, then fight with improvised tools, then fight with bare hands if necessary. The council soldiers struggled with this concept, but they learned. "You need to understand," Washington continued, "that the moment you accept limitations is the moment you have lost. Humanity never accepts limitations. We do not have claws, so we made knives. We do not have tough hides, so we made armor. We do not have wings, so we made aircraft. Every limitation is just a problem waiting for a creative solution. And when creativity fails, we fall back on determination and violence." Dr. Park's Biological Warfare Division was disbanded after the Swarm War, the Council finding the entire concept deeply disturbing. But the knowledge remained, carefully preserved and studied. Humanity understood that sometimes you needed tools that civilized beings found repugnant. They kept those tools sharp, hidden away, but ready to use if another existential threat emerged. James himself moved into theoretical research, studying the swarm's remains to understand how such a thing could evolve or be created. What he found disturbed him deeply. The swarm showed signs of intelligent design, genetic markers that suggested it had been engineered rather than naturally evolved. Someone or something had created it and released it into the galaxy. He brought his findings to Sarah and the council leadership. "The swarm was a weapon," he reported, "created by someone with sophisticated knowledge of both organic and mechanical systems, which means whoever made it is still out there, possibly watching to see if their weapon succeeded." Threll's scales paled. You are saying this was an attack? I am saying we do not know, James replied, but we should prepare for the possibility. If the swarm was a test to weaken galactic defenses, its failure might prompt a more direct assault. Then we prepare, Sarah said firmly. We build up the joint defensive force. We train more humans and counsel soldiers in combined tactics. We make sure that whoever is out there knows that attacking this galaxy means dealing with species that are either too sophisticated to defeat easily or too primitive to defeat at all. The galaxy settled into a new normal. Trade resumed, colonies were rebuilt, and life continued. But there was an awareness now, a understanding that had not existed before. The universe was dangerous, and sophistication alone would not protect them. They needed pragmatism, adaptability, and the willingness to fight ugly when necessary. Humanity found themselves in a unique position. They were no longer quarantined primitives, but were not yet considered fully advanced. They existed in a middle ground, bridging the gap between the Council's sophistication and the harsh realities of survival. Other species began to see value in this position, studying humanity not as primitives to be pitied, but as survivors to be learned from. Sarah stood before the Council 5 years after the Swarm War, preparing to give her final address before stepping down as ambassador. She had aged noticeably, the stress of her position etched into lines on her face, but her eyes remained sharp, determined. When I first came before this council, she said, humanity was an afterthought, a quarantined species too primitive to matter. We were invited to help only because every sophisticated option had failed. But we did help. We showed you that sometimes the best solution is not the most advanced one. She paused, looking around at the assembled representatives. 5 years later, the galaxy is stronger because of the partnership we have built. Council technology combined with human pragmatism has created a defensive force unlike anything the universe has seen. But do not make the mistake of thinking we have won. The swarm was defeated, but its creators remain unknown. Other threats will emerge. The universe does not care about our treaties or our civilizations. What is your advice for the future? Threll asked. Remember the lessons we learned, Sarah replied. Stay sophisticated, but keep simple solutions available. Pursue progress, but do not forget your origins. Build advanced technology, but make sure you can fight without it. And most importantly, never give up. The moment you accept defeat is the moment you ensure it. She stepped down from the podium, her speech finished. The council gave her a standing ovation, a gesture rarely seen in their formal proceedings. She had earned their respect, not through sophistication, but through the very human qualities of determination and pragmatic thinking. On Earth, in the human colony on Mars, on stations throughout the solar system, people went about their daily lives. They worked, they loved, they argued, they dreamed. They were not special, not chosen, not destined. They were simply human, stubborn, creative, willing to use whatever tools necessary to survive. And in the end, perhaps that was special enough. The universe had learned a lesson it would not soon forget. When all else fails, unleash the humans. They might not solve problems elegantly, they might not follow proper protocols, they might not respect the rules of civilized warfare, but they would show up, they would fight, and they would absolutely refuse to quit. And sometimes in a universe that was fundamentally hostile to life, that refusal to quit made all the difference. The galaxy would never be the same. Not because humanity had conquered it or transformed it, but because they had reminded everyone of a simple truth that had been forgotten over millennia of refinement and progress. Survival does not require sophistication. It requires determination, adaptability, and the willingness to do whatever is necessary when the alternative is extinction. Humanity had those qualities in abundance, forged over hundreds of thousands of years of surviving on a planet that tried regularly to kill them. They had brought those qualities to the galaxy, and the galaxy was stronger for it. The Swarm War ended. But humanity's story was just beginning, because that was what humans did. They showed up, they fought, they survived, and they kept moving forward. Always forward, never accepting the inevitable, never surrendering to the odds, never giving up. Because when you came from a species that had looked extinction in the eye 17 different times and lived to tell about it, you learned one fundamental lesson. Nothing was truly inevitable. Everything could be fought, and with enough determination and creativity, anything could be survived. The universe would learn this lesson repeatedly in the years to come, and every time it forgot, humanity would be there to remind it why being the galaxy's designated survivors was not about being special. It was about being too stubborn to know when to quit.